Okay, so who is the first judge amongst us? The judge's hat. You wear it or you hold it, up to you. But when you have it, you are the judge. Okay.
So, Judge Holden, when you visited the kid when he was in prison, you you said to him that you were judging him and rejecting him because he had sat in judgment on himself, and he alone had reserved an ounce of clemency for the heathen. And I just wondered if you could tell us what evidence there actually is that that's true.
What evidence is there that you have spoke that question to which you receive an answer? You answer only yourself when you question me.
Okay, but that doesn't really, that's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is about actually what did the kid do that meant that he alone sat in judgment on himself, like specifically? Because from what you said, it sounds like you don't really have an answer, like you're just kind of winging this and making it up as you're going along.
Wing, what's this phrase, wing? I wing, I am the winged demon.
Yeah, again, this is really impressive. Desires. This sounds really impressive and really cool, and if I was a bit stupider, I'd probably be really overwhelmed by it all.
Sure.
But you're not actually being very clear or like providing any evidence for what you're saying. So could you, why do you think he alone sat in judgment on himself?
I think that the kid, if that's what you call him, had seen into my soul, and it is a sooty soul of a rascal, but I had never felt that before. I'd never seen anybody look into my soul, and I had to do something about that.
Okay, so that's not really anything that it's not that he sat in judgment on himself or was weak. It's that he's seeing something about you that you're uncomfortable with.
I'll let you be the judge.
You're kind of the judge.
Thank you.
Okay.
And do you have another question?
Judge, what happened with you and the kid or the man at Jake? The end of the novel. What did you do?
Well, I gathered him in my arms, and we talked, and I came to understand his purpose in leaving his home, and I realised that he and I were not so different, and that in fact he sought my ideals and he had always listened to my teachings, but that it was that once I had imbibed him within me, once he was no longer my antithesis, I no longer needed him, and I used him, and then I disposed of him.
Thank you. Who's the second group I asked about? We have our second judge.
Thank you.
It's a bit big for you.
Maybe Toby.
It suits you. Okay.
Judge, do you have any choice in your actions, or are you just a pawn in this world?
Should we go for the second one straight in? And if you do have any control, why do you choose to behave in the way that you do?
It could be that none of us have any control over anything that we do. And I'd remind you of the time when Webster was protesting that he did not want to be in my sketchbook or be drawn by me. And I had to point out to him that it was my book or another book, that it was inevitable that he would end up in some book, as it is inevitable for me to end up not in my own book, but in another's book. And therefore, if I am to defend myself against this charge, I would say that none of us, as characters in Cormac McCarthy's book, have any agency at all. We are mere puppets, and Cormac McCarthy is our God. I have no free will, no agency at all. Is there meaning to be found here, therefore, without agency? Well, I would remind you again of what I said to Webster. What is to be deviates no jot from the book wherein it's writ. How could it? It would be a false book, and a false book is no book at all. So this hinges on whether this is a false book or a true book.
Super. Our third group. Tom. Tom is our new judge.
Our first question has been a bit asked already, so I'll modify it slightly if I may. Even assuming the judge did think that the kid had sat in judgment on his own deeds, what did he feel about that? Why did it upset him or disturb him or annoy him?
I felt that the kid was a mystery to me, and I really don't like mysteries. I would have killed him and let him die a long time ago, but it fascinated me. He wouldn't go in my book. As soon as he goes in my book, I can probably come back and kill him. But until then, well, I'll just keep talking to him. He'll keep showing up at random points and maybe some not so random points. And I think one day I might be able to understand him, but one day he'll be in my book.
So, Judge, do you really exist? Are you real, or are you something that's found in every man's conscience? Are you part of every man?
I think it's very difficult for me to answer. I am flesh and blood and a lot of skin. It's a strange thing. Men need little provocation to act in the way that I tell them to act. There is something fundamental in the heart of man which I call to. All I do is call them to the dance, and all men will dance. Which is why, even though the kid now will not dance, one day he will. He is man, and all men respond to my call, as it were. I do exist, but I exist in many forms, I think. And one is not necessarily more real than the others.
Judge Holden, have you ever been with a woman?
Women don't exist for me. Going back as far as you need to know, the role of women gradually disappeared, as they meant nothing to me. Never have. They provide nothing, and they had no role in what I made of myself, which is what you see. what I'm allowing you to see. That's all I want to say about that.
Have you ever been afraid of anything?
I'm afraid all the time. But what I fear is the loss, the failure of people to understand as deeply as I do what they're really like and behave as they should. They must. And so I quell that fear by creating, allowing, making things appear which allow people to show what they're really like, men, to recognize what they must do. I've overcome my fear. It's amazing. Thank you so much. Can I have a hat? You don't have to be the judge anymore. I've just got one more question for that judge over there. Why did you do what you did to the Reverend Green?
What did I do?
You told him. You told the assembled crowd of religious folk that he had congress with goats and 8-year-old girls.
For the same reason as I do anything. Simply for the pure, unadulterated revelry of it. Because I revel in chaos. I revel in the dance, and lots of my, well, I wouldn't call them friends, but lots of my companions often idolise me and seem to think that I just wander through life, you know, as a powerful figure, but without purpose. But the reason that I keep going, and the reason why I keep dancing, is because I love to watch people suffer.
So why then do you claim that you single out the thread in the tapestry of order?
Because it's good for business.
Okay, no. All right, thank you. So, I think we got some extraordinarily different judges there, didn't we? And some really fascinating ones. And I thank you very much for inhabiting the roles in the way that you did. I thought that was terrific, and they were really smart questions. And for the rest of the session, we've got about another 15-20 minutes together in this part of it. I'd just like to open it up to analyse in a bit more detail those questions that we asked and look at the answers that we got, because they were very different. We had a kind of fraudulent judge over here, didn't we? But we had a really quite deeply serious one.
Yeah.
And then we had another one who was keen to represent himself just simply as a fact of some other system other than the one that he's in the fiction. And then we had yet another judge here. So I'd like to explore those ideas a little bit. So, we can talk to each other as groups or just put questions out there for discussion.
I'm interested by. I'm sorry, Judge. As
call me Ronan now.
All right, Judge Ronan. I'm really interested by your representation of the dance as chaos.
Yeah.
Because to me, the dance always struck me as this kind of ordered. It appeared as chaos, but in fact was quite regimented and quite strict. I'm just interested to know what you think about the image of the dance.
I think that, is there could you call it ordered chaos, or is that just a kind of contradiction of terms? I see the judge. I mean, which kind of feeds into what you said about the judge inhabiting the fiction. I've always seen, and this may be simplistic, because I've lived with the book for a lot kind of fewer years than lots of people here. But I've always seen the judge as being the embodiment of the novel itself, of the novel's. Does Blood Meridian have ideals? I don't really think so. But if it does have any tangible ideals or kind of moralistic messages, which again I don't think it does. I think that no, you're shaking your head. I don't think it does. But I think if it has any order, as far as what you're saying, the judge is the embodiment of that order, and for me that order is no order at all. If that makes any sense.
That's really interesting. Dave, you had a remark.
It's taking us in a different direction.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
I have one more.
Okay, and then we'll come to you, Dave.
Sorry. So what strikes me in all the books about Blood Meridian especially is just the sheer sense of movement.
Yeah, that's
that the entire novel kind of permeates. They're riding on all the time. And I mean, one of the things with the Reverend Green scene is they're sat there listening to the Reverend. They're immobile, and then the judge comes in, and all hell breaks loose.
Yeah.
But everything is moving again.
Yeah.
So there seems to be something about that. I haven't quite figured it out myself yet, but
well, I think for me that is not proof, but kind of suggestion that he is what I would call like an agent of chaos. I think he is. I remember Nick saying this in the very first lecture where I learned about Blood Meridian, was that he is demonic. He is kind of, that's the whole thing of him coming out of that bit where he steps out of the fire, and he is abstract, and he isn't. That's why it's interesting to kind of ask questions, physical questions about him as a being, because he really isn't a physical being in some ways. But I think you're right. I think I think the movement thing's a really good point. I think that's kind of what I feel. It's very propulsive as a character.
I should explain, it will become clear why I'm doing this, but I should explain what question we started with, which we very quickly abandoned, which the first question we pretty much all agreed on would have been, are you Satan? And the reason we did not end up with that question but very quickly moved on was this sense that if there is any moral agent in the novel, it is the judge. That even if this is an entirely deterministic universe where everybody else is a follower, and even if the judge himself is merely the person who most realizes that there is no possibility of agency for himself or anyone else within a deterministic universe, he still seems to propose a personal set of moral values, even in his acts of evil. He has a point of view, and it is fixed, and he stands by it. And that is in itself a moral standard.
Very like Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men.
yeah, absolutely.
Similar kind of.
Yeah, it's great. You can single out the threat, can't you? in both Jagger's and the judge's attitude. Dave, you were going to thank you. Dan, that's great. Were you going to take us in a different direction, or is there something else?
I was interested that our judge sounded almost penitent.
That's interesting.
And I wondered whether Judge Holden has penitence in him. Given that every meaning is tabernacled. Let's go for the camera. Every meaning is tabernacled in every other meaning. If the judge is who he tells us, then he presumably has penitence in him.
Yeah.
Do we ever see that at all? Do we get a glimpse of that at any moment?
Yeah, I thought that. I thought that was really interesting, and I thought John's portrayal of the judge was of a man weary of the dance. Actually, I thought that was really very interesting. So that's a good question. We should respond to that.
It reminded me of Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defence who designed the Vietnam War, and those kind of mea culpas that McNamara delivered to Cameron.
That's a very good point. And of course, Blood Meridian being written around that time. That's fascinating.
I think my portrayal of the judge shows what a crap actor I am. What I was projecting, I was saying to somebody, McCarthy is the author who has written books that I can't finish because I can't take any more. I didn't finish all the Pretty Horses. I couldn't take it. I managed to trudge through the gore up to my ankles in this one. And I think what came out was a sense of, oh, shit, I don't want to have any more of this. And I think you're quite right. Utterly alien to the judge, who's, whatever it is that might possess someone who actually feels good when there's violence. I feel that something's been enacted that should have happened. As Dan says, it's a sort of moral position that no one else is allowed to have. The judge is the only one who, in the sort of George Bernard Shaw way, is given these long set-piece thoughts. And when they do come out, you're right, I got it completely arse-end up. He's quite happy to see scalps, buggery, God knows what. That's the way things are, it seems.
Suggesting you had things arse.
Can you speak up a little bit, please?
I wasn't suggesting you had things arse end up. I suppose I was thinking about where, in the manner of the Border trilogy novels, for example, where Cities of the Plain takes us through to the end of the story of those two boy men. I wondered what the sequel to Blood Meridian, what the judge would look like in the sequel to Blood Meridian.
Mm.
Would there be penitence? An older man reflecting?
It depends how much you interpret him as being satanic or human, I think.
It also depends on whether you see him as an older man. Because McCarthy specifies that the kid is now a man towards the end of the book. The judge hasn't changed. He hasn't changed.
No.
So does he actually age? Is that a thing that he does? Like,
Well, he will never die.
Exactly.
Well, he says he'll never die.
I think, James, you should denounce yourself as a believer in the judge as a massive fraud.
The judge owns the narrative.
Sorry?
The judge owns the narrative, and the judge controls the Glanton gang partly through acts of representation, partly through acts of narrative. So if the judge says he will never die, he will never die.
I don't want to take over, but in that paragraph at the end that describes the dance, it's at the start it says he says he'll never sleep, he says he'll never die, and at the end it's moved to he never sleeps, but it stays he says he'll never die. So if it was just true that he's never going to die, why would it remain as he says he'll never die rather than he'll never die? That's my thing. As I say, I don't want to hijack.
Because McCarthy is drawing attention to the act of representation again and the provisionality of it. He says, indicates its provisional nature. But if Holden controls the act of representation in the novel, that's what makes him the suzerain.
But if it's still that he says, he can't. If he completely controlled representation, it would just be he'll never die because he controls everything. The fact that he says means that somewhere the novel is still holding back some element of control because it's still keeping it as a provisional frame as he says he'll never die, but he may be lying, may not be true.
One thing I also find really weird at the end of this novel, and the last line, he says that he will never die, is the fact that it's immediately followed by the end, which is explicitly put there. I guess separated from the epilogue, but I think that's interesting that it is always there in every edition. It always has in capital letters at the end, and then it denies that ending by having the epilogue, and it ends. They all move on again. So you have this continual he will never die, that will continue, but then it's denied by the end, and then that itself is denied by the epilogue, which explicitly ends. They all move on again, and then you don't have the end. So the novel keeps seeming to enforce and then deny the possibility of an ending, which I think
It's trying to exist beyond itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, what's also kind of playing into that is when that in that scene where Tobin and the kid are in the desert and the judge is kind of pursuing and overtaking them, we have Toadvine and Brown who either stayed with the judge or went towards the judge when they separated from Tobin and the kid, and then later they meet again and the judge is wearing the hats and the clothes and he has the guns of both Toadvine and Brown, and nobody believes the judge when he says it was waiter. They chose to give me these things. Nobody believes him. Everybody thinks that those two are corpses rotting under the sun. And then we find them hung in California later. Brown with the necklace. And the kid goes there and explicitly sees it's Toadvine and Brown he sees hanged. So we don't believe him that he actually didn't kill them, but he really did. So how, is he that much of a liar, or is he actually telling the truth?
Yeah. I mean, I'd say for me, he lies quite a lot, I would say. And even just because they survived doesn't necessarily mean that, everything that he said about that event was true. It just means that he didn't. It just means he didn't actually kill them.
Yeah, but that's what we believe.
But it doesn't matter whether he's lying or not if the power resides in him.
How do you mean?
Well, we can invade Iraq on the pretext of weapons of mass destruction, whether it's a lie or not, because we have the power to do it in the White House. So, similarly, does it matter whether the judge lies or not if he retains authority, power, the intellectual heft in the novel, if he is the agent of moral order, all these things? Does it matter whether he lies? His authority seems so entrenched that it really doesn't matter.
But are there not points where you could say that there are, towards the latter half of the novel, that other characters do start to question the judge's authority? That in a sense, I mean, again, this is my thing, but the judge's authority starts to kind of unravel. That particularly the kids and also some other members of the gang, there's evidence that they are gradually becoming disillusioned with the judge as this kind of all-powerful figure.
And
they're starting to
it really starts to unravel. So yeah, carry on. Yeah.
I mean, there's the entrepreneur when he's coming across the desert, and he's the entrepreneur fleeing from a medicine show. A degraded entrepreneur, or a degenerate entrepreneur, I think, fleeing from a medicine show. And it's this image of a kind of charlatan, just gradually starting to see to see through the deceptions. And I would see kind of the epilogue in that light as being a kind of an escape from the judge's sort of false control, a kind of false authority. I know that you're, because I've read your book, and I know that you don't feel like that, and that's fine. But yeah. Sorry, yeah. Let's stop there.
I think you can see the epilogue that way, certainly. But you can also see the epilogue as a confirmation or a kind of completion of the project that Glanton and Captain White and Holden are progressing. The epilogue shows us the land of the wilderness, the barbaric waste, measured, marked, fenced, commodified, the westward expansion at its end point. And if you read White, Glanton and Holden as agents of manifest destiny, or westward expansion, whatever you want to call it, I mean, the epilogue, isn't it? I mean, we could sit here and we could talk about the epilogue till Christmas and we wouldn't agree on it.
That's great, yeah. Anybody who hasn't spoken yet wants to intervene, you're very welcome. This is a form of democracy, this campaign. And it's also a form of tyranny.
Well, I'm kind of doing my paper here. I really have bits of it discredited in major fashion. But, I mean, the judge sees off all of the voices that challenge him in one way or another, or they fade back into the text and vanish. Toadvine, Kid, Black Jackson, Tobin, he either does away with them or they vanish. So quite where that leaves kind of oppositional voices, or the a notional weakening of the judge's credibility, I don't know.
Small question. Do you think the judge's stature and his physicality, his size, contribute to his overarching domination? Do you think if he were a small man, he would be able to have the same effect on these men?
No.
I mean, he's alien. That it marks him as profoundly alien. He's huge, even for our time. But you also have to consider this is 150 years ago. People weren't that tall, so he's absolutely massive, and he's vast. There's that vast abhorrence of the judge and the naked face, and that he's just, and strangely childlike with the small hands. So he's just an oddity, and you'd have to just sit there and look at him. That's probably also why people don't stop him when he's preaching, because you'd be so fascinated by that massive thing, sat there talking and speaking in a manner that they wouldn't. I mean, the kid is completely illiterate. I think the only person who's described as being able to even read is Tobin, and he has a bit of a set apart role. So he'd have to. It's like the sky darkens when he starts. When he gets up and starts to speak.
But one of the things that I think is interesting about him, and possibly the thing that you could argue keeps the group, the gang, in his thrall, maybe not the most, but it's an aspect of it, is how effeminate he is. Or I mean, I'm reading that, but the way that he's often described as being, I'm trying to think of a quote, but like dainty would be a word I think McCarthy uses. And I think that's something that makes him alien to them as well. In a novel that's obviously largely devoid of any, completely devoid of any female characters, of any, even anything close to approaching agency, of existence almost. He is feminine in many ways, I think, and I think that's why he combines that in a very kind of in the masculine world with Glanton, who the only closest we get, I think, in my opinion, to Glanton having any sort of sense of interiority is that scene where, like, we're looking into the fire. That part, I can't remember the quote, but it's a big, long passage at the end of one of the chapters. I think 2/3 of the way through the novel, and you never get that from Glanton. But I think part of, and that's, he's asexual. I think I'd see him as being asexual in some ways.
Glanton or the judge?
The judge, I think he's both. He has desires, but he's so ambiguous in that, and I think in that sense, and I think
this is sorry to interrupt.
No.
But this, your question, both your questions are very interesting there about sexuality. And
I found that
about
fascinating.
Femininity.
It's a great question.
So what prompted you guys to come up with those, and particularly and rule out others?
Well, we
kind of came out of talking about his potential backstory,
Yeah.
wasn't it? Because although we do see him as this demon, we were thinking that maybe it robs the novel of something if you see him as just this demon, but that he is also he is a character.
Well, he's born of woman as well, isn't he?
We wondered whether he'd been abused as a child.
I think he definitely has. I think
we do find him. There's always kind of casually there's a dead child or a missing child, and then 2 sentences later the judge is running around somewhere naked. Throughout the entire book, and that's kind of a casual kind of thing that's happening. It's not even really remarked upon except for once.
No, it's the dandling of the Apache child on his knee
Yeah.
before he scalps it. Surely the most horrific part of that novel.
It's that what Tobin objects to?
Tobin puts the gun to
Tobin
his
too.
head.
Yes.
And the judge says, pull the trigger or take it away.
maybe he's not. I think I take back what I said about being asexual in that case.
Well, I
But
wonder
he's
if
quite androgynous.
Yeah, but I wonder if his proclivities are so obscene, and that even McCarthy feels unable to record.
Well, that makes it more horrific, I think, in concealing that from us. And as you say, that's the only point at which there's even any close reveal of that, or the point when is it who's it? Is it Glanton or somebody stumbles across him in a barn with two Apache children, I think. And that's, for me, that's the other really horrific
Oh yeah,
point in the novel.
that's in the river. The
Yeah, that's
bank.
it. That's it. Yeah, because it's robbed of any of that kind of carnivalesque, death hilarious stuff, which is more kind of which is obviously much more like Miltonic.
Yeah.
In the Comanche
And also the scene at the end, you know, we don't get to see what happens because it's too horrific for even McCarthy to tell us what happens. Which is why I was interested in your articulation of the answer to that question.
Well, I felt that I couldn't articulate it like myself, so.
But it's some,
could.
you know, it's some form of consumption, it seems. Or,
I think in connection with what Katja was saying earlier about movement and pauses and impetus, even if we're not going to talk about it in terms of sexuality, there's, for me, somehow related to flows of blood and the violence, a very visceral sense of libidinal drives at play here, with no object.
Yeah, I mean,
that's very interesting.
That scene with the Legion of Horribles, they end up castrating their victims and then falling on them, sodomizing them in that kind of frenzy. There is another scene where they come across a scene of massacre where men have been castrated and their genitals stuffed in their mouths, quite very explicitly. So there is something about that.
Yes,
definitely.
I mean that's really interesting.
We have about 5 more minutes.
McCarthy is said to pay a lot of attention to histories of the time.
Yes, very much
So did those things really happen?
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a particular example of the Comanche raiding a fort around this time and perpetrating just those acts of genital mutilation on men.
They're newspaper accounts, aren't they?
I noticed Philip Mayer did the introduction to this edition. I don't know if you read The Sun.
No.
His latest book. That's interesting because he references Blood Meridian directly, particularly the Horribles bit, basically saying that things like this never actually happened.
That's interesting.
So he actually counteracts that particular scene in McCarthy quite directly and says that never happened. He talks specifically about Indians wearing bridesmaids' dresses. And in the novel, not as the author, but a character in the author says, you know, things like that are kind of made up by writers, and he is very explicitly, although he is very praising of McCarthy, obviously takes him to task over that.
That's interesting, over that particular detail. Yeah, I mean, I've seen no evidence for that, the Legion of Horribles, but I have for the other kinds of violence that we see described.
But if you're going to genocidally eliminate a group, you demonise them first. So I would want to see social historians look at those newspaper articles and say, yeah, Comanches cutting off genitals and eating them or whatever. Who saw it? It's just the sort of story you need if you're going to wipe out the Comanches.
Yeah.
No, it's quite true.
And it's also not going to be reported on white folks doing similar things, or you know, kind of embodying the Native American spirit and slaughtering people just in order to get more people against them. That wouldn't be reported in the New York Times at the time.
And it takes us back to the origins of scalping, which are historically very dubious. You know, there's evidence now to suggest that the Pueblo people, rather than being these pastoral farmers, were actually people who scalped quite a lot of their neighbours quite regularly in order to make sacrifices for better weather and so forth. So there's actually increasing evidence that the history of that particular activity is a long one in the southwest. So you know, this stuff starts to come to light.
I always end up coming from a Ballardian point of view because that's my default mode. But it's something that Ballard says about Western readers who were horrified by his description of life in the concentration camp in Empire of the Sun. And he says, what you people don't realise is that you're the odd ones out. Most of the rest of the population of the world lives constantly in this degree of violence and mayhem and chaos and very short lives, and the history of the world is primarily one of atrocity and your ideals of European civilization are really a blip. And I mentioned that to point out that, do we really find the violence in this novel so exceptional, or is it in fact the rule even today?
Well, it might be a good one for you to answer, John, as you I mean, Peter Joseph, who we'll have with us later, has also struggled with the violence here and has put the book down, and others I talk to have, so it's not uncommon.
That's not just a Pollyanna, but I teach my students whenever we have a class about what makes human beings human. Chimpanzees eat each other. Human beings eat each other, but the groups that have produced us are the ones that found ways of cooperating rather than winning through violence. Now that's a story I suppose I warn myself when I tell it. I want it to be like that. I want people to be nice.
Well, I agree.
Not going around scalping. But so it's a long-winded way of saying no. I don't think it's that way. Even I don't think violence is so necessary as part of the human condition as the judge proposes. But I'm always hamstrung by the moment I hear myself say that. Well, do you think that's the way it is, or is that the way you want it to be?
Yeah, I think McCarthy would disagree on that point.
I also disagree. I think that violence is an inherent, nature in the human condition, and all of the McCarthy that I've read, I read as a comment on the human condition. I think he does get that down to a T, and that might be very discomforting for readers and for the population to sort of come to terms with, particularly the white middle class academic population that we are. But I think he gets humanity in a way that's very spot on, if very distressing.
In the same way that the judge gets everyone else, but they don't get him.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Our world of middle class academics and professionals and such like is not so violent, and the books we read are normally not containing so much violence. This humanity is even if this isn't a view of humanity, it's not one we all necessarily share. Our world doesn't participate in it so much. So it was interesting to counterpoint a rereading of Blood Meridian with the exciting events in Paris going on, when there's people perhaps closer to the gangs in operation. And I'd like to go back to something David said some time ago, talking about White and Glanton and the judge as agents of manifest destiny. I see that more clearly in the case of White, although he's a rather failed agent in contrast to the more successful generals in the US-Mexican War. I don't see Holden and Glanton in the same way. They're operating in a period outside any, that's not their aim, certainly not their intentional aim, and they're outside a state, they're outside the rules of law. And one question I'd like to ask about the idea of a sort of sequel to Blood Meridian, where in these later times, when's the book end, 1878 or thereabouts, where will the judge find followers? He seems to describe himself as the last true dancer left, and the others are all false dancers.
Syria.
Yes. But no. That's a good answer and a correct one, but perhaps a little less in the States, where after all there wasn't. There's been no war in the States.
Well, Vietnam is the answer. If you read Robert Hare's dispatches alongside this book, then you some of the language is even similar. And I think.
Yes, I agree, and there are certainly local patches of it. But I think one of McCarthy's points is that at the moment in middle-class America, it's not like that. It was more peaceful in the 80s.
I think the novel already, this is post-Vietnam.
Yeah.
This is a post-Vietnam novel, and it is in many ways about Vietnam.
Yeah.
The signing up of the kid, for example, up to page 38, is almost verbatim. It could be a scene from any one of Kubrick's,
It could also be, I'm not going to quote some bits later from Nicaragua and El Salvador.
Yeah.
You know, the US trained death squads operating in Central America at the time that McCarthy is writing this.
And just as no country as the Iraq War, you could.
Exactly so. And you know, as for violence and its role within Western democracies, I mean, I think there are any number of perspectives from political science, for example, that would tell you that our entire the structures of Western democracy are all built on sublimated violence of various kinds, be it economic or class violence, be it the violence that is sublimated within the liberal social contract. You know, the Hobbes, Locke, that lineage is all about, you know, the social contract coming out of those sources, on which our society is based, is about retaining and restraining chaotic, disordering, violent tendencies within society. I mean, and that's what the law does, and that's what the social contract does. So I think you could certainly argue that, you know, the violence that McCarthy is talking about, well, it's certainly there in what many Americans like to think of as the period of national foundation of westward expansion. And I think, you know, there are certainly many voices today who would argue that that kind of violence, racial, economic, political, is certainly very, very much there, but just in sublimated forms.
I'm going to have to close, and there'll be other opportunities.
Yes, absolutely.